STPI. She has 11 years of work experience, where for 7 years she has worked in the commercial and Islamic banking and learning sector of Pakistan. We have with us Ms. Radhika Menon, who's joining us online. She leads the Evidence Use Hub at Oxford Policy Management and is the Deputy Director of the Strengthening Evidence Use for Development Impact Program. She has over a decade of experience working on evidence-informed decision-making in multiple sectors. We have with us Ms. Alia Hamza Malik, who will be joining us in a bit as well. She is a member of the National Assembly since 2018. Currently, she is Parliamentary Secretary for Textile, Commerce, Industries and Production and Board of Investment. Lastly, we have Mr. Harun Sharif joining us online as well. He is an economist who has served as a Minister of State and Chairman Board of Investment. Prior to this, Sharif Saab served as the Regional Advisor to the World Bank Group for South Asia and remained Senior Regional Advisor to the UK's Department for International Development, DFID for short. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to the welcome remarks and the technical presentation. So first, I'll just request Dr. Waqar Ahmed to give the welcome remarks and then proceed to the technical presentation that he has. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahnur. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's really a pleasure to see many of you here once again. After a long time, I see many of you have been part of this program, this effort. We have, of course, worked together, but I also see some new faces. So in the interest of just introducing this subject, strengthening evidence use for policy making is something which, of course, I think institutions were sitting on the table as well as otherwise have been pursuing for quite some time. But SEDI gave the opportunity to actually bring all these institutions together and work as a consortium towards exploring the role of evidence in policy making across diverse sectors. And SEDI has been operational until recently in Pakistan, Uganda, and Ghana. We, of course, saw some changing priorities amid COVID, due to which the work on SEDI slowed down. But, of course, there are learnings from this program that we are here to draw today and take them forward, given the core capacities, capabilities of the institutions who have been involved. In Pakistan, the SEDI consortium was led by the Oxford Policy Management, and as Mahnur said, we will have our colleague Radhika talk about this online in a moment. But we've also had two other partners, very esteemed partners, which include Tabad Lab and Spark. And of course, with these partners, we have tried to put forward a very comprehensive political economy analysis study today, which is, of course, with you and can also be accessed online on STPI's website. Now, I think just to start with STPI's own presentation, the way, of course, the division of labor was done, that we had STPI looking into the political economy of evidence in economic policy making. We had Tabad Lab looking into the same subject, but for education and skills sector, and we had Spark looking into, again, the same subject, but for child labor. And of course, Amjad Saab has helped that cause here. And I thought that we'll just kick off with a very brief presentation on STPI's work, and not going into too much detail, given that you will have the report with you, which can be studied and will be available to answer any queries. but largely just wanted to take you through the intent to improve data and evidence systems as they exist in today's government setup, and then maybe try to deep dive into trade-related policy making out of all the other areas within the economic management. Of course, those includes BFM, taxation, energy, but we have just taken a case study of trade-related policy making and then tried to see the evidence ecosystem in the trade sector, and then also propose some entry points for evidence use interventions. So let me just start with a brief footnote that while, yes, SEDI may be nearing its end, but the entry points for evidence use which the three institutions would offer over here, those are really very current and something which are derived from our consultations with the government partners. I'm sure that all the institutions represented over here would, of course, love to take some of these recommendations on entry points forward with the government. A bit on the problem statement, that how we started with studying the role of evidence in economic policy making, and we thought that economic policy making has over time become fragmented, and it was necessary to prioritize it and see it as a subject through a whole of the government lens. And largely, of course, the problem statement which was in front of us, it was that macroeconomic imbalances have been a characteristic of Pakistan's economic trajectory, and we really wanted to see if evidence can play a role in sort of improving or reversing these imbalances, particularly if that evidence is coming from local actors per se. We have seen, of course, that this problem statement was set in pre-COVID days, but as the statistics now shows that amid pandemic, things, of course, changed very quickly. Last year was extremely difficult with a negative GDP growth, sort of high risks of inflation and expected inflation, reduced government revenues, and pressures on the external account. While Pakistan has come out, but the talk with regards to macroeconomic imbalances still surfaces quite often. And I think amid the pandemic, one really saw an intent at the government level to improve the data and evidence systems. We have Mr. Harun Sharif Saab with us. We'll have him talk more about this. And at that point, if we recall, in the pre-COVID time, the IMF program came up with, of course, a policy agenda which supported evidence-based policy making. In fact, made a very strong case for it. There was high-level official interest in improving Pakistan's ranking and ease of doing business and trading across borders. Government launched Pakistan Regulatory Modernization Initiative, again, a very evidence-based efforts which focuses on improving firm-level competitiveness. And there was a general push towards seeing the role of technology and how it can lead to reducing barriers to trade through automation, rationalization, or elimination of perhaps the obsolete regulation. We also see that this intent did not exist in all the sectors. So while yes, some sectors were willing to look into the evidence which was pouring in during COVID times, and there was a push by international development partners as well, but we needed a criteria to actually see that which sectors were actually open towards or more receptive towards testing and experimenting evidence use interventions. And within these areas, trade and trade-related investment regime within the overall economic policy management sphere offered the most meaningful room for informed experimentation and learning Of course, we did study the public finance management space, we studied the taxation space, we studied the energy space. In all these sectors, we found that in a COVID year, things were really in a firefighting, reactive mode, and time for reflection or experimentation was fairly less. While this wasn't the case in the trade sector, where you had greater openness to work on evidence use interventions. We also, of course, saw that apart from the greater readiness at the government level, the trade regime had greater linkages with international commitments which Pakistan has made in agreements such as the GSP or other market preferences. We also have trade-related departments which have stated intent to address social inclusion considerations, including, for example, improvements to labor market, improvements to environmental standards, etc. And there was readiness of non-government local actors as well to work in this direction, most notably the private sector or the business associations. And this in a sense strengthened the case to pick up the trade sector within the overall economic management space. We started off our political economy analysis with, of course, the very basic question on who decides on trade policy and regulation. And of course, a large part of this work did, of course, push for a more sort of collective effort across the government, and we are now happy to see that there is a Prime Minister-led effort which is called the National Export Development Board. And it is different from the previous such forum, which was the Cabinet Committee on Export Promotion, and the NEDB has private sector participation as well, which is a very welcome sign. But then you have various themes over here where, for example, the decision-making may or may not lie with the Ministry of Commerce. So in case of trade diplomacy, for example, there is a large, of course, footprint of Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well. Of course, in collaboration with Ministry of Commerce. Likewise, in case of a decision around free trade agreements, we see several other ministries who have decision powers with regards to who gets preferences, including the revenue division. Then you have the tariff policy, and of course, as part of this work and efforts by many others, after several decades, we have seen the tariff policy role go to the leadership in Commerce Ministry. Previously, of course, you had other institutions like FDR who were playing quite a decisive role in tariff policy setting. COVID also prompted the need for e-commerce policy, and this work was expedited, and a framework was approved in February, a very welcome sign. Again, in case of e-commerce policy framework, the Ministry of Commerce is expected to work very closely with the central bank as well as the provincial e-commerce councils, which have been recently set up. In case of transit trade, the Commerce Ministry works very closely with Ministry of Interior and various law and order agencies who come together, logistics, Ministry of Maritime Affairs, Ministry of Communication, who come together to take a decision on transit trade. And then, of course, trade and services, which also brings together several ministries, not one. So a very comprehensive analysis on who decides on trade policy is essential. It's essentially the first question that one should ask in any PEA analysis, and then try to see that how does one go about reducing the fragmentation that, for example, mars the trade policy decision making. The next question was to actually map out the evidence ecosystem in the trade space and try to see that who are the actors over here, government actors, non-government actors, and we have this diagram in the report which you will see, which essentially talks about who are the knowledge producers in the trade space, who are the knowledge users, who are the knowledge brokers, and how do they all come together. But of course, for any evidence use intervention, one does not have the liberty or time or resources to work with all the evidence partners. And this brings us to the next question, which is that who is interested in evidence to inform trade policy? Out of all these actors which we have shown, who would be the most interested? And we did this power interest attitude analysis. There could be other ways of doing stakeholder mapping as well. But we did this very basic analysis to bring out the influential active backers who would back this agenda of using deeper levels of evidence for informing trade policy and practice in Pakistan. And we did find that apart from Ministry of Commerce, you had good business associations out there who had interest, who have actually made their own investments in making evidence more comprehensive. And then, of course, you would have some active backers within the government as well, which of course includes the bureaus of statistics, the central bank, the associations or incubators and accelerators of startups, for example, Ministry of Industries and provincial industries departments, for example. And we really hope that this kind of stakeholder mapping would allow the Ministry of Commerce in the coming days to really form a deeper level of consensus around STPF, which is the Strategic Trade Policy Framework, which will be the longer term vision of export competitiveness in Pakistan. Our next question was that within the ministry that is custodian of the trade policy space, how is evidence generated and used in this sector? And we, of course, found that Ministry of Commerce uses evidence from own as well as other sources. But then you have data pouring in from business associations, from think tanks, from experts, who produce diagnostics on trade performance. And for Ministry of Commerce, the processes as well as the systems required to actually answer the question that whose evidence is credible. That's very necessary. Of course, there would be evidence which comes from, let's say, select lobbies, and it'll be the role of the ministry to actually decipher or filter or actually see that where are the economy-wide or social priorities best addressed. We also studied within the ministry through a very quick organizational diagnostic framework, that how is this evidence being used at, for example, the formulation of national tariff policy, STPF, e-commerce policy, transit trade agreement, for example, which is up for revision with Afghanistan. And for each of these policies, of course, there's a different type of evidence, but for us, the main learning was that the way through which that evidence is used for each of the policy setting is different. And it's of course heartening to see that some of the sections within the Commerce Ministry have actually customized their own ways of evidence use. And we have Ms. Tayyaba Batul here, of course, who have worked in the Commerce Ministry, and we would love to hear from her as well how the dynamics of or how the uptake of evidence happens in the ministry as well. And based upon these two questions, basically, we had identified some of the gaps with regards to internal capabilities to use methods or to reform processes and systems around the evidence use, which could help in trade negotiations, which could help in public-private dialogues, which the ministry has the mandate to do under the rules of business. Based upon this analysis, we have provided 6 or 7 entry points for evidence use. The first one was with regards to addressing the enabling elements for evidence use. Of course, the enabling evidence are the availability and correct use of data, information, intelligence, knowledge information systems, but also regulations that enable the budgets to produce and procure evidence and to build linkages between knowledge producers and knowledge users, which is extremely necessary. In our analysis, we found that data, information, intelligence to a lot of extent did exist, but there was a demand from the ministry to have a better knowledge information systems or knowledge retrieval systems at the ministry when the need arises. We also felt that an ease has to be introduced in the way research is procured or commissioned by the ministry. This is particularly true for rapid analysis or rapid research, which is required by the ministry, and this was a key requirement amid the COVID times. Of course, we also felt, and this is point number 3, that mapping the evidence needs of trade negotiators was something which was missing, and that can be improved. You have trade negotiators who are dealing with APTA, you have those that deal with bilateral trade, you would have those who deal with multilateral agreements like SAFTA. And for each of them, the evidence needs would differ, and a more deeper mapping exercise would help the Commerce Ministry here, or a more deeper diagnostic exercise would help the Commerce Ministry here. The next point is actually, the next entry point is related to that, which is that evidence use at this aggregate level is something which is much more required. For example, is the evidence related to unorganized sector, potential exporters, startup exporters, women-led enterprises? Is that evidence reaching the Commerce Ministry or not? Is there a systematic or a structured system of public-private dialogues with each of these marginalized or periphery sort of actors in the export sphere? And then finally, how can technology help evidence use? We have seen a proliferation of trade portals amid COVID-19, and one would really like to have an evaluation now whether such portals have served the interest or not. My conclusion, of course, is, yes, thank you. My conclusion, of course, is that just 3 big points here. First is that our political economy analysis, or the chapter which was authored by STPI in this report, it advocates that trade sector offers promising possibilities to address problems in evidence ecosystem. And we felt that the collaboration with the Commerce Ministry and its attached departments offers a good opportunity to improve understanding for design and implementation of trade policy. The second big message is that the process of forming the trade policy has the potential to change many other policies, thus necessitating the use of evidence during the entire process of the change. I would like to welcome MNA Alia Hamza Malik Saiba, who's Parliamentary Secretary for Ministry of Commerce. Madam, thank you very much for taking out time. And the second big, of course, message was that the process of forming the trade policy has the potential to change other policies, thus necessitating the use of evidence during the entire process of change. For instance, trade policy will have strong knock-on effect regarding removing of anti-export bias via tariff policy, strengthening the uptake by business community of the already signed trade agreements, and boosting trade diplomacy efforts as well. A third big message was that promotion of evidence use at the Ministry of Commerce will bring about improved social outcomes, which Pakistan needs to comply with if it wishes to remain eligible for preferential trade access, including in the EU and US markets. And of course, we also plan for such access in the Far East, and there are pipeline FTAs with other countries as well. And those negotiations could be best served if evidence use interventions are tested, are experimented as we go along in the decision supply chain. So these are the three big messages from this chapter, and I'll give it back to Mahnur. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Waqar. Next, I'd like to call Umar Saab to please come in and present his presentation.
Thank you, Manu. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here. This report launch brings back some very fond memories from pre-COVID times when we could interact a lot more freely and sit in STPI conference rooms for days working on this. Dr. Saab has set a very interesting context in terms of how evidence could be used in some of the economic decision-making in Pakistan. When we were thinking about the topic that was introduced as part of this project, which was education pathways into employment, we explored the entire education landscape, primary and formal education, technical and vocational, tertiary, non-formal. And it was a hard choice to think about one area to focus on. And what we decided was that skills offers a very interesting avenue of analysis and insights into how we could integrate evidence into better employment pathways. The reason for choosing skills is rested basically on Pakistan's unique demographic. If you look at Pakistan's population, we're the 5th youngest population in the world, where approximately 60% of our population is between 15 and 33. But what is even more interesting is that the median age is 23, which basically signifies to the availability and the opportunity that lies for a very young, energetic population and the vast potential that developing and grooming this population offers. Now, what is really important is how we look at converting this opportunity of having a youth bulge and a demographic dividend, which is going to start to decline with every coming year, and really channel this into a productive workforce for Pakistan, which can help both the social and economic progression that we much need. In terms of why skills becomes really important is the outcomes that we see in formal and traditional education channels. We've seen that formal schooling hasn't really been able to deliver what it should have. This is evident by a large out-of-school children in Pakistan. This number, while it has been decreasing over the years, we still have 19 million plus out-of-school children in Pakistan. And this is between the age of 5 and 16. It's a constitutional obligation for us to be able to provide free education to this age group, but we haven't been able to. The progression from primary to middle and middle to secondary and then to tertiary is significantly low compared to regional peers or from objective standards. Where approximately 7 to 8% of the student population that actually makes it into the education system eventually transitions into tertiary or higher education. On the employment side, our overall labor force participation is low. It is particularly low for females, and that is a huge challenge for an economy of ours where we have a fairly balanced split between males and females. The skills base and the quality of skilling and the corresponding opportunities that are available to people who've been through the skills training setup is particularly low, both locally and internationally. A very small number that points towards this is that 32% of our labor force has not even completed secondary schooling. So with a base of population that's large and growing, and a skill base that is low and poor and could be much better, this offers a very unique possibility set in terms of really pushing our progress on SDGs in general, but more specifically SDG 1, which is no poverty, SDG 5, which is gender equality, and SDG 8, which is decent employment and economic growth. These three are really central to this discussion on how evidence could be used to improve pathways to employment. What happened during COVID-19 has been unprecedented, while the unique challenges and issues it has created for both public health systems, for life and value of life, and the economic pressures. What it has also done is it has really fast-tracked how the world has approached, adopted, and mainstreamed digitization. And what we've seen is not just locally, but internationally, the pace of progression has increased significantly. Now, while that offers a lot of unique and interesting opportunities for Pakistan to explore, there is a downside, and this rapid digitization has caught countries like Pakistan off guard, where the gaps and the potential exclusion from a rapidly digitizing environment could be very significant in terms of challenges. So the groups and the population segments that were ready have taken a leap and progressed much faster. But the ones that weren't ready or enabled from a digital readiness perspective or digital literacy perspective stand to lose a lot, both in terms of economic, social, and other aspects. The kind of conclusion that we draw from what we've seen in terms of what happened during the pandemic and how countries and systems and sectors have responded is the definition of the skills sector or the skills path to. In terms of the project itself, we looked at the political economy analysis both at a sector level and the evidence ecosystem level. In terms of sector, there are a number of key findings. There are different actors involved in how the skills sector is shaped, designed, and executed in Pakistan, from political actors who are interested in relatively short-term gains and boosting employment and training opportunities, to development partners who look at the sector more strategically and are invested in some long-term reform, to a number of factors like industry and beneficiaries who have different preferences. And it's really important to be able to understand these perspectives and integrate evidence in how each of them pursue their priorities, programs, and ambitions. The other key thing was the quality and relevance of skills training opportunities available to people in Pakistan, particularly the youth. The quality of skilling programs is not at par with what some of the regional peers and other LMIC countries, low and middle income countries, have been able to achieve. There is a significant delta both locally and internationally on how we could improve the quality and relevance to be able to better place trained people from Pakistan. The third and really important aspect again is the positioning and perception of TVET, where it's generally treated as a secondary or an inferior stream compared to formal education. And what we've seen from some of the global trends, especially in the technology sector, is that this is a fast changing environment, and a lot of preconceived dispositions like skilling being less less appreciated or less useful than formal education is being challenged by global giants. So the positioning and perception of the TVET sector is another challenge that could be addressed. The roles and responsibilities of the sector from an execution and policy perspective are split between federal and provincial, and there is varying capacity between each of the provinces. While prioritization can be something under the 18th Amendment that provinces take ownership of, there has to be some work on making sure that each of the provinces are enabled and capable of being able to manage the TVET programs in a more consistent and coherent way across the board. And then the regulation and enforcement is another area which requires and generates a lot of evidence, which can help players improve quality and force regulators and stakeholders and apex agencies to monitor and loops back to the quality argument, where the quality can be improved through better design and enforcement. On the evidence ecosystem side, there is a predominant focus on administrative data for the skills sector, where we're interested in aggregates and numbers that help us understand the scale and volume, but there is limited availability of quality of learning skills and receptiveness of what is being taught in these programs. There is some focus on experimental and rigorous techniques to evaluate the interventions and what kind of impact they have, and that needs to be mainstreamed and aligned with how these evaluation and experimental cycles could be better aligned with policy cycles. So results and evidence from these interventions should be available to policymakers at different tiers and allow them to be able to integrate these findings and pieces of evidence in how they design, perceive, and deliver programs for better skills outcomes. The National Skills Information System is a strong starting point, which has been developed to address some of these challenges, and a lot more could be done there in terms of how robustly it's populated with data, how effectively it's used by different stakeholders, and more importantly, how outcomes and tracking outcomes could be embedded in this system. One of the key findings that we had was there's a lot of external to the system support from development partners and other agencies in supporting the development of these systems and promoting and pushing the use of evidence. But the limited number of actors who produce and eventually consume evidence in the skills sector leaves a lot of room for more focus on how robust and quantitative and qualitative evidence could lead to better design and execution. Now, the key question that we wanted to focus on was, where should evidence be used? How should it be used? What is primarily the purpose or the existential reasons for increasing and focusing on mainstreaming use of evidence? And the unanimous answer to that was better outcomes, better employment opportunities, improved pathways that lead segments and cohorts who haven't been able to complete schooling, who have never been to school, who haven't been to programs that have enabled them thus far, and lead them to pathways both internationally and locally. To conclude, in terms of entry points for the program and the key focus that could be a strong anchor for the use of evidence was to integrate this in the government's predominant focus on youth development. There are a number of programs at the federal and the provincial level, Kamyab Jawan, the National Skills for All strategy. They've all identified and are moving towards really important areas in terms of how the youth engages with more productive opportunities, how some of these opportunities are converted, how evidence could be mainstreamed in better design, implementation, and monitoring of these systems. One of the really important aspects is how to use evidence to bring more coherence in the different initiatives being managed and executed by different stakeholders within the public and the private sector. And it's really important to be able to draw synergies between the different sectors, like the Digital Pakistan initiative, the e-commerce policy and planning that Dr. Waqar talked about, regional connectivity, how some of the SAS programs are going to be focusing on this. Evidence across and cutting through all of these would be really important. The core finding from the last year and a half of living through COVID-19 is digital is essential. And it's really hard for us to imagine a future where digital is not at the forefront of any skilling, discussion, agenda, programs, or implementation. So what would be really important is to understand how digital has transformed the landscape, both in terms of skilling and employment, understand how the future of work is changing very, very rapidly, how some of the opportunities that we had perceived in a very unidirectional or linear way are not as simple, and be able to understand how Pakistan is adapting and and responding to all of these changes, which is happening both globally and locally at the same time at different paces. So integrating evidence into how we develop and train a future-proof labor force, how that labor force can contribute towards Pakistan becoming a knowledge economy, and the role of evidence as a central guiding force in all of this is what we think would be really important for Pakistan to make this transition. Thank you so much. I will hand back to Manur, hopefully in time, and move to the next part. Thank you, Manur.
Thank you, Umar. Next, I'd like to call Amjad Saab to present, please.
Thank you, Manur. Assalamu alaikum and hello, everybody. I think it's so unfortunate that at the juncture of 1921, which has been declared as an international year to end child labor, and of course we have already committed through SDGs, particularly goal 8.7, that we are going to eliminate child labor in all its form by 2025, which seems a far cry. With this reference, I think, unfortunately, policy making in Pakistan is usually driven by political ideologies or at most by socio-political perceptions, but rarely by evidence. And same is the case with child labor. Since 1990s, although we have come a relatively long way, but Pakistan comes from denial of the existence of child labor to of course, accusation of NGOs, particularly NGOs and media, that they play up the number of child labor, etc., and affecting our economy. We have now accepted it, but allow me to say that quite reluctantly, that child labor is there. But how much, what's the number, and which area it comes from, etc., is not very clear. Let's say Pakistan Labour Force Survey 2017 and 2018 says that there is almost 12 to 13 million children are engaged in child labor, and nearly 47% of our population is below 18, out of which 13.7% aging 10 to 17 years age are occupied in multiple forms of child labor, including the worst forms of child labor. And 5.4% of the children aging 10 to 17 are occupied in hazardous tasks, one or another forms. And domestic child labor is still a mystery. We have no idea how much number, particularly girls, and in which areas do they come from, how many houses they are working in, and the general excuse that comes through that it's a private arena of household and how can one enter into and identify how many girl children, what's their age, are working in how many households and urban areas, or let's say suburban areas and similar. Child labor, of course, survey is still in process in the provinces and territories, all the 4 provinces and territories, that is Gilgit-Baltistan, formerly FATA, and Kashmir is still in process, but we have no idea how much is the number. Unfortunately, no classified data is available with us. Adolescent and of course the children below the age of 14, and in rural areas, urban areas, suburban areas, agriculture, herding, fishing. It is generally believed that 2/3 of the children are engaged in child labor, and whenever we speak of child labor, usually we speak of child labor engaged in different establishment, enterprises, workshops, or hospitality industries in urban areas. While there is a serious need to collect data so that we can move towards appropriate and adaptable policy formulations. Presumably, child labor has been increasing during the COVID-19 because there is evidence from several other countries. And of course, evidence has been collected in Pakistan, but very small, limited, NGO driven or NGO organized certain researches, but at the national level, we have no idea how many children have fallen victim to the child labor during the COVID-19, which sector, and of course, which schools particularly, the public schools or the low-cost private schools or madrasa. The data is once again silent on that count, so that we can proceed towards effective policy formulation. Of course, in that situation, there is a risk of losing more children to child labor, although some progress has been made, but there is a serious risk of reversing whatever gains we have made in the last 10 or 20 years. Number of immigrant families who have been working in urban areas are known to be moving back to the rural areas, and no idea whether they are going back to school or working over there or engaged in child labor or herding or fishing or some other industries. And of course, there is an added risk of children facing hungers, and no formal or specific program has been devised for them, although ESAS and WISP have given some support, but X number of months and a very limited amount of support, and which is no more there. It's almost a year that government of Pakistan extended some support to the families, not necessarily or particularly to the children. In our case, I think we have really seen a debate in the parliament about child labor. Legislation is made, but mainly either advocated by NGOs or under certain influences of ILOs or UNOs since 18th Constitutional Amendment 2010, although we have seen some provincial and federal legislative measures about child protection and against child labor, but once again, under international influence or through some advocacy demands of media and the NGOs. Punjab is the only province which has come up with domestic child labor legislation, but once again it prohibits child labor and below 15 and allows light work and part-time work for other persons under 15. And Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is the very first and perhaps the only province so far which has adopted child protection policy. Once again, let me say that without any particular evidence, it's in a way not a comprehensive policy, but it's the only province which has devised its child labor policy. Generally, it is widely believed that child labor is the product of poverty and helps the poor parents to have some additional income. But it is also known, researches have been collected and data has been collected from other countries, that it also causes intergenerational poverty. And of course, a recent evidence by ILO and UNICEF study suggests that when poverty grows 1%, child labor goes up to 9%. But in case of Pakistan, we haven't got any evidence. And its correlation with population growth has rarely been spoken about. And we also know that uneducated, unhealthy working boys and girls might become a burden on the economy when they grow up. And relatively, if the state takes the responsibility of universal health, universal education, and universal social protection, I think it can contribute towards the development of our economy than the child labor or the children themselves may contribute. Of course, no budget allocation is made for any programs for the elimination of child labor on part of the government. Whatever programs are there that we see, either with the support of UNICEF or ILO or certain NGOs. There is a serious lack of intergovernmental and inter-sectoral cooperation. And of course, it's true in case of child labor as well. Of course, and it affects effective policy making in other sectors, and in this case, child labor. And certainly, there is a need to bridge this interconnectivity gap and fill out evidence gaps. And particularly with reference to the private sector, supply chains, as children are employed in formal and informal economy in Pakistan and family enterprises as well. Once again, there is an evidence gap and we haven't got any specific data. And through data, Pakistan, if the particular data is specific data is available, Pakistan can adopt effective approaches as well as effective theory of change. How can we eliminate child labor? Pakistan is one of the first few countries who has committed SDGs, including goal 8.7, that they will eliminate child labor in 2025, but it does not seem possible at present situation. Pakistan seriously needs to work in partnership with sweatshops, supply chains, petty businesses, workshops, and hospitality industries, family enterprises, and without knowing how much child labor is engaged, where and how much they are paid and what kind of exploitation happens, everything else is either perceptual or it is known through newspaper reports or certain reports generated by the NGOs or CSOs. When policies, in this case, are usually formed without data, it becomes very difficult for government or relative labor institutions or labor inspectorate to bring forth any transparency or hold the responsible entities to account. While collecting evidence, I think once again, girls and boys should be the center of the proposed policies and be exercised to be allowed to exercise their own agency. I mean, what is their own experience? How do they understand about this whole situation? How can the government or respective institution can help them to come out of the policy? And as we know that children belong to schools, not to the workplace. So this is the overall situation that we have seen with respect to child labor. Much of that is perceptual, or that we can accumulate from different information collected in bits and pieces from NGO-oriented work or some newspaper reports. There is a serious lack of comprehensive policy making because there is a lack of comprehensive data around. And I think it's very important that the government of Pakistan and all its in child labor sector, it's an elaborate sector. There are different institutes and departments, but everything happens without information, without proper data. Therefore, child labor has I mean, if it might have increased during the pandemic, but generally it has, if it has come down, it has come down very little. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amjad Saab. Now I'd like to move on to our discussants for today. Firstly, we have Dr. Faria, who is Research Fellow at STPI. She'll be coming in to speak first. Before she comes, I'd just like to request both discussants to limit their interventions to 10 minutes each. Please, Dr. Presentation.
Thank you very much. So some very useful insights from the evidence ecosystem presentations of the earlier panelists. So today I'll be speaking more from the point of view of a BCure trainer, Building Capacity Using Research Evidence Trainer, a program by Evidence for Policy Design unit by Harvard Kennedy School of Public Policy, under which the civil services of developing countries, they are sensitized about use of evidence in policy design and actually integrating evidence into the policy making process. And I'll be sharing some of the learnings of this program, that how you can actually start about thinking about evidence, how you can perceive evidence, and how you can integrate evidence, and some of the feedback from the policymakers, our very own civil services of Pakistan. So this is, the first slide shows how actually you can start thinking about evidence. Why do we need evidence? Why data alone is not enough? Because we live in a very complex world where the public policy problems are too complex. We have to navigate through these problems to come to policy solutions. Otherwise, we will land in policy failures. And just to quote a very famous macroeconomist guru, Danny Roderick, that world at best is second best. That our world is too complex, that replication of the public policy models or importing the successful public policy models from the developed world is not going to actually solve our public policy problems. So the first rule, there are certain rules for actually thinking about evidence and integrating them into policymaking process. The first is to think through theory. Theory is the fundamental, it's the base of evidence-making policy design, where we focus on developing, evaluating, and refining the theory of change. So one of the pillars of evidence-based policy design is that you actually develop a theory of change, that how your problem will progress and finally culminate at a solution. And we have to be very mindful that since it's a complex world, our theory of change may break down at a certain point. It may not go the way we perceive it. So we have to reset theory of change at every point in time, at every step of the policymaking process. Then we have to dive deeper into the data. We have to gain theoretical insights, and the fundamental principles are that we have to understand what data tells us and what it doesn't. So from an evidence perspective, data standalone is not sufficient to solve public policy problem. Data conceals, data does not reveal certain aspect, and only these aspects are evident when we gather evidence which is all scattered around us in bits and pieces. The principle number 2 is consider what's shown and what's not being shown. Again, data has this quality that if we show biasness towards the selection of data, it will show certain aspects while certain other aspects will be hidden, which can only come out if we dig deeper, if we delve deeper into the data. Third principle is know where the data comes from. Again, this is very important. The credibility of data, whether it's a highly authentic database that we are using in public policy problem, or whether it's a garbage in, garbage out that we are using in our public policy problem. Fourth is do not jump to conclusion. And this is very important. For an evidence-based policy maker, it's all about thinking about the problem, going deeper into the root causes, into the primary causes, into the secondary causes. Thinking of a solution right away is totally prohibited. You cannot think of a solution. It's not an impulsive decision making that, oh, okay, so if we increase number of our PhDs in countries, it will lead to economic development. That is when you are actually jumping directly to a solution from the problem. In evidence-based policy design, it's all getting down to the root cause of the problem, and then at a very later stage, you will come down to solution, and actually the problem and identification of problem will lead to the solution. So if you see, third is consider political economy. So context matter a lot for evidence-based policy design. You cannot think of a public policy solution without a context. Political economy matters a lot. The landscape may be different for a certain area, and it can be entirely different for another resembling area. So political economy and context are to be very deeply focused upon. And fourth is the counterfactual. And for that, I have very interesting 2 pictures where a child is shown with a pencil and a paper, and another child is shown without one. So the child without any pencil and paper is actually the counterfactual of the education policy problem. So in evidence-based policy design, the more focus is on the counterfactual, on the have-nots rather than the one who have it. So it will be a more focus on why this child is not able to attain a quality education, what is actually impeding this child for not attaining education, what is the barrier dimension, is it the problem from the supply side or from the demand side, rather focusing on the other side of the flip side of the problem where the child is actually in a position to attain this education. So again, I will be sharing some of the world-recognized approaches. Again, it's learning from the BCure program, that in evidence-based policy design, this is how a public policy problem is approached. This approach is called SPEEDY, and it is actually, the first step is to identify pressing public policy problem. Then we diagnose underlying causes. And as I mentioned, we go deeper and deeper into the primary and secondary causes. Then we design high potential and feasible public policy solution. After a design, which is quite close to reality based on the context, based on the political economy, based on the evidence that we have gathered, we actually move on to the implementation phase and monitoring solution on the ground. And the last three steps are the most weighted upon in evidence-based policy design, as implementation comes with a lot of monitoring. And after implementation, you have to test high potential solution with rigorous evaluation. Testing is very important, and normally most of the testing comes through impact evaluations. And again, refine solutions based on continuous monitoring and feedback. So again, these the public policy problem, whether they pertain to the area of health, education, development, they're too complex. You have to continuously refine them, you have to continuously test them, and then eventually you will come to the real solution. So that is actually a structured approach for systematic research and policy, and needs localized contextual research and solution. Another aspect, so if you can see that evidence-based policy design is actually a framework. It's a totally a mindset that needs to be embedded. It's a system that needs to be institutionalized. It's not that a policymaker gets up one fine day and says impulsively that, oh, I will apply evidence-based policy making to this particular project. It's not workable in this manner. It has to be institutionalized, where the policymaker has a know-how of evidence, he or she believes in the concept of evidence, and he's aware of the tools how to apply it, and he's patient enough, and the institution is patient enough to wait for the precise results and solution. So if you see, this is very important. And again, if you see that public policy problem, they're not like based on data, they do not exist in a standalone perspective. So for any public policy problem, if you look at from an evidence perspective, this paradigm is very important. Like, it has to be technically correct. Whatever you have thought about a program, it has to be technically correct. It has to be politically supportable, and it has to be organizationally implementable. So if any of these circles, they are out of alignment, it's going to lead to a public policy failure or a public policy collapse. It's not about what we need right now, what the data says that we need this amount of development. It's about how the entire paradigm is working holistically in total. So just to give you an example, let's allow me to give you an example of sustainable development goals. So sustainable development goals are technically correct. Of course, we need all these goals and indicators in all these 17 areas to solve developing countries' problem. They are globally recognized as a good solution for development framework. They're politically supportable. The government of Pakistan is signatory to sustainable development goals, and it's showing all the zeal and energy to pursue them. But if we see this problem with organizational implementability, data on basic indicators are missing, data on goals are missing, data for certain province like Balochistan, the framework is not complete because the baseline data is not there. The indicators information is not there. So if any of the circle is out of alignment, it means that, you know, the public policy problem is not going to work in the end. So it has to be a holistic evidence-based approach where you're actually thinking out of the context. You're actually thinking out of the project that you are given, and you are going beyond the frame to the political supportability and organizational implementability. So allow me to talk a bit about how we sensitize the civil services under this program, and what actually is the planning process of Pakistan. So we have to ask these questions: that what are the shortcomings of the planning procedures? Is the planning procedure based on data and evidence? And how our PSTP projects, whether they are federal in nature or provincial in nature, do they use evidence in actually pulling off the programs? And how much of evidence is, how the evidence is gathered, what are the means and the sources, and what is the quality of gathered evidence? So, and to what extent the prescribed planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation procedures are followed. So just to give you an insight, this is the format of our planning process of any public sector development project, which comprises of PC1, PC2, PC3, PC4, and PC5. So if you look at this, there's a lot of thrust on the formulation and identification, where actually the projects are pitched to these core committees, where they are identified that these kind of development is needed. And then for the implementation, again, there's a lot of activity and a lot of focus on the PC3 phase. But PC5, where actually implemented after the closure of the project, the actually when it's about testing of impact and generating evidence on that, there's little focus on that. And for number of projects, the PC5 forms come at a very later stage, or somehow it is missing from the data. So now if we talk about one of the areas that I would like to talk about in terms of evidence, which is also on today's agenda, that is education. So just to give you an insight that how we have to look at this problem. So if we look at the Millennium Term Development Goals that were earlier there, and most of the conventional policy making concerning education, it's mainly about enhancing the enrollment rates, the primary education enrollment rates, the secondary education, and the tertiary education enrollment rates. But how we see it through the lens of evidence is that we will see at the learning levels of the children, rather than upon enrollment rates of the country, because enhanced enrollment rates or a sequential progression to a grade, to next grade, or age, it does not signify learning. So for that, an evidence-based approach is a pedagogical skill tool or approach that is called teaching at the right level, where we actually group a 7-year-old with a 12-year-old who have the same learning levels. And just to show you that the ASAR report, one of the most credible, authentic data sets on education in Pakistan, in one of the reports, it is mentioned that 29% of the class 5 children are not able to do a single-digit subtraction. Now look at the gravity of the situation. When I state that 29% of the class 5 children in Pakistan are not able to do a single-digit subtraction, I'm talking that they're not able to subtract any number from 0 to 9 out of 9. So definitely a sequential progression to grade 5 is there. They have reached this grade 5, but their learning levels exhibit that they're not able to solve a class grade 2 problem. So this is how this problem will be treated through an evidence lens, that they will be put under this teaching at right level approach, where they are segregated, they are given teaching accordingly, according to their learning levels, and then it is enhanced. So, lastly, when we talk about how our policymakers see this evidence-based policy design, whenever we deliver this in-class sessions and the modules, they're very excited about it. They do endorse these ideas of impact evaluations, of treatment, of interventions, of counterfactuals, but there are limitations which are at the institutional end. They do not have evidence-based policy design. It comes with certain cost, especially when we talk about impact evaluation, which are quite costly. It also needs patience, and at times, which somehow for certain policy problems, they don't have time to elongate these evaluations to a longer period of time. So there is endorsement by policymakers. The only thing that needs to be done is to institutionalize them. Like in the trade study we have seen, and it will definitely give very credible and holistic public policy solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Fariha. Next, we have Ms. Radhika, who is joining us online. Radhika, over to you.
Thanks very much, Manu. It's a pleasure to be here. Manu, may I ask you to switch off the mic there? It's causing feedback. Yeah. Okay, I think that will be fine. Thank you.
Radhika, we couldn't hear you.
Sorry?
We couldn't hear what you said. Could you repeat what you said?
It was causing an echo. If you can switch off the mic there, that would help in the, the feedback. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it's fantastic to see the work of SETI being presented and a real in-depth look at the political economy of evidence use. So what I thought I'd focus my remarks on are how do these findings in Pakistan compare with some of the findings we've seen elsewhere in other countries? So this sort of a political economy analysis was also conducted in Ghana and Uganda. And then though it's a small sample, it's really interesting to see some of these patterns remain the same. And so what can we really take away from this, where we see these recurring patterns of how evidence is being generated and used? So just a few points. I don't have a presentation. So I think one of the things that you see across countries is that you find that the political elite are influencing governance systems, policymaking, and they influence it to the extent that even for an issue to get on the policy agenda, it's all in their hands. So it could be religious and cultural groups, it could be big firm owners, it could be lobbies, and this remains the same across countries. And I think in the Pakistan case, you see that really coming out with the child labor sector. And so what is the takeaway for us? The takeaway is that without aligning to political incentives, merely trying to improve capacity or even trying to improve motivation to use evidence will not happen if you don't align with political incentives. Another thing that you notice is that international development partners in all the three countries that we looked at focused on a few sectors. And in Pakistan, you again see that with economic development. So you have familiar peers there, IMF, World Bank, they focus on a few sectors. In Uganda, you had donors focusing on family planning, gender-based violence, issues that are not prioritized by others. In Ghana, similarly, you had the World Bank and IMF focus on public financial management and taxation. So you find that with donors focusing on a few sectors, the evidence ecosystem changes. And there's a question that is often raised, is this sustainable? When donors come and have these projects, is it sustainable? Does it really contribute to developing a very locally owned, strong evidence ecosystem? And this is something, it's a question that we grapple with in Pakistan as well. So as part of this analysis, we also looked at, the extent to which countries have been able to institutionalize evidence use. So what do we mean by that? To what extent it's part of the system? To what extent there are laws, there are policies? So to give you an example, in Uganda, there is a national monitoring and evaluation policy. And the monitoring and evaluation directorate is housed in the office of the Prime Minister. And that makes a difference, the fact that it is housed within the office of the Prime Minister. Again, I know that Pakistan has engaged with similar issues of which agencies and units are autonomous, how are they placed, where they're placed, and how that affects evidence generation, how that affects use. So it's also interesting to see that, again, countries grapple with similar issues. There's duplication of structure, so you have multiple departments producing the same data. There's lack of coordination. But I think the silver lining here is that with institutionalization, with creating these laws and policies and processes, you can be making progress. But there is a need for shifting from just using evidence for the purpose of accountability to actually using evidence for learning. So similarly, there's lots of these laws, there's the SDGs, other international policy frameworks. You see that there is a move to generating more data, but as a panelist before me just said, like, where are the gaps? And we saw that there are gaps, especially in the area of gender equality and social inclusion. How much of this data is actually looking at the drivers of structural inequality, the drivers of inclusion-related issues, and this becomes a common problem. Another issue that has been alluded to in the presentations is looking at organizations. So in SETI, we called it AAA. What does that mean? It means, is there authority to make change happen within an organization? Are they influential enough? Does the leadership endorse change? Is there ability? And that means, is there capacity? Are there staff? Do they have the skills? And finally, is there acceptance of change? So are they motivated? Are there incentives to make change happen? And with each organizational unit, so it could be different governmental departments or agencies may have a different issue. They may rate very high on one A, but very low on another A. So which means that when you are trying to tailor strategies, you need to be addressing the different A's, and it needs to be iterative. And I know that SDP has been doing some wonderful work in this area in carrying out a diagnostic on evidence use, precisely to be tailoring strategies to organizations. And I think when we often look at big systemic issues, we miss out on the specific issues that organizations face. Another very interesting finding, which I think is common across many countries and not just this countries that SETI focused on, is this emphasis on nationally representative quantitative data. So, I think, and this is something that I always try to probe people on, when they say we need to use evidence, the question we must ask is, what type of evidence do you mean? And often the answer is it's monitoring data or statistics. And often that is the answer with government decision making. So how do we promote the use of other kinds of evidence, whether it's evaluations, impact evaluations, qualitative research, citizen feedback? And there's a second implication of this, looking at just nationally representative quantitative data. It is that what is going on at the subnational level? How do we strengthen systems? And like in any other country, I think in Pakistan also, I think the experience has been varied across provinces. Similarly, I think by looking at just nationally level quantitative data, you may be missing out on a lot of issues that specific population groups, marginalized population groups face, because some of those issues come out in qualitative research. So how do we sort of think about drawing on different kinds of evidence? And where, as someone said, how can it be more question driven and problem driven rather than just enforcing change on the outside? And then finally, I think, again, something that was striking across countries is that, and I think Waqar raised this, what is credible evidence and who is considered credible? And we find that governments often prioritize evidence or data that is generated by government departments, international organizations, or a selected few. So the issue is one of building trust, and how do we do that? And I think one of the presentations alluded to the fact that sometimes it's simple procurement reforms or issues which can help bridge and make those networks and build trust. So just in conclusion, I think that this sort of an analysis, we should be thinking about how to integrate this in the work that we do, because it's just not about developing capacity to use evidence. It's about thinking about evidence accessibility, but also thinking about incentives, norms, motivation to use evidence, not just at the individual level, but also at the organization. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Radhika. That was quite insightful. Now I'd like to call upon Mr. Harun Sharif for his special remarks. He's also joined us online. So over to you, Mr. Harun.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a very interesting. I congratulate all the partners who have participated in producing this quite a lengthy report, which I received only yesterday. So I could only see parts of it, and I saw a presentation. And congratulations to Dr. Wakar and Umar in Tabad Lab and other partners. And very good to see Ms. Alia Hamza sitting here from the government side. Uh, 3, 4 remarks. I think the countries who have progressed, particularly in Asia, because that's more relevant to Pakistan, then I was a bit surprised on the countries selected with Pakistan, which are not necessarily in Asia, and they have different set of, culture and problems and policies. So countries in Asia, there are two things I have seen consistently. One is that they managed to make good, robust, evidence-based policies. But more important thing, which has actually developed, their trust among the rest of the world and within their own country, is that they managed to adjust policies based on evidence and kept them consistent. So there are two messages which I want to give upfront to this debate is that yes, we need a lot of evidence. We need data to support the policy making processes. But the key at the end is that will that translate into a good policy? And policy, by the way, is not a piece of paper anymore. Policy actually is something which is outcome linked. So please ask yourself a question as Wakar has worked on trade policy. Do we really have the outcome-based trade policies which sets targets very clearly based on evidence? And then you basically work backwards that what is needed to achieve that. Policy, if it is a wish list, maybe based on evidence, then perhaps, you will not inspire confidence of the people. So I wanted to upfront make this point that Pakistan, we are growing and we need to sustain our growth. And for that, obviously, everybody knows, all of you know better than me, that what we need is, more investment coming in. Our investment to GDP ratio is 15%. By no, econometric model or forecasting that is sufficient to create opportunities for this size of a country. Our competitors, then I would again say our competitors, when we look at Bangladesh or Vietnam and others, the investment to GDP ratio is in the range of 25% plus. So now the fundamental question is that perhaps, such a useful paper should look at that, the evidence of our peer group, that what they have done right on trade policy and investments and other things, which we are not doing. It's very good to see that report looks at multiple angles of political economy. But if we look at politics, I'm not a politician, but I have been very closely watching politics. So basically politics across the globe is becoming populist, reactive, constituency focused, intuitive. Now, somehow our research or policy thing needs to take into cognizance the realities of life. We talk about short-term nature of politics, we look at that thing, but that is the reality of life. So some of the major, multinationals and large companies in the world, in the private sector, have actually stopped doing long-term policies because, the world is in a flux and the evidence changes very rapidly. So you need to have a flexible policy framework where you can make, adjustments. But I was when I was part of the government system, where I used to get very scared sitting in Economic Coordination Committee and others, that very critical matters would come and there's a word called, the cabinet summary. Now that summary practically is a document which seriously lacks any relevant evidence. So I think when you talk about institutionalization, you start from the high level that at least, people use some evidence, and key decisions which later on proved very fatal politically, like sugar prices, the wheat crisis, if we had done a little bit more research in the beginning rather than rushing it. So these things are live examples. But at a micro level, I did see the politicians' appetite in the PTI government and other governments as well to actually use evidence very productively and immediately. For instance, Waqar mentioned ease of doing business, and we looked very good by taking almost over 30 points, increase in 2 years. So I used a lot of evidence to name and shame people, because I could tell the Prime Minister that an electricity connection takes X days, whereas our competitors do it much, much, better. I could basically use the actual evidence that you cannot register a company in 1 day, whereas, SECP is claiming. So that's how we tried to push the micro level evidence, and immediate decisions would take. But I would not advise actually that use evidence for naming and shaming of bureaucracy, because at the end of the day, then you will be the victim. So moving from that side, 2 more messages and then I will stop. I think in terms of Pakistan, the fundamental question, if this kind of work has to take forward, Waqar has looked at macroeconomic imbalances and numbers. Pakistan needs a lot of evidence on certain strategic interventions. For instance, we need a lot of evidence on the potential relocation of industry from China. We really don't have much. Now that is something, a mega development. We do need evidence on, these specialized economic zones. We are just building brick and mortar. We really don't, we are not working on what to be done. Why I'm quoting these things are because they are linked to our structural imbalances of export promotion, of investment, bringing in and other. We really don't have even the mechanisms to gauge impact, of any investment, why tourism or, for instance, construction is better than, investing in some of the real sectors like food, for instance. So I'm just, on these things, I would advise, in future that you look at that. And I will close basically on one thing. The current structure of, the state institutions, I would humbly actually advise, Alia is sitting there as well. State does not have the capability to do quality research themselves. They will never be able to hire quality people. And so there's a change of mindset you need. And I saw it in the UK about 15 years back. Perhaps it's better that you train people that how to outsource research and use it. So close down the research houses you have in ministries. That's my advice one. My advice, unless you close down, you will never be able to use the quality research like, people sitting right next to you like those. Otherwise, there will be duplication, there would be second guessing. So that is something you need to change the way we look at evidence. I would also advise, it was mentioned that it was a good thing that an export development board is coming. Pakistan has miserably failed to actually, put right kind of skill mix in these bodies. They get very easily captured by bureaucracy. So creating new things is not necessarily a reform to me. I think we need to let go lots of things which bureaucracy controls and priorities of the country so that the country sees there's a wider ownership of evidence. And for that, perhaps you would need much, much deeper communication strategy than just doing few webinars. So thank you very much. With these thoughts, I congratulate and wish you all the best.
Thank you very much, Harun Saab. Your recommendations are very well noted. Last but not the least, I'd like to invite our chair, Ms. Alia Hamza, to please come up on stage and give your remarks, please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It's good evening now, ladies and gentlemen. It's really an honor to be with you on this a very, very interactive session. First of all, I will comment on the two things I've just noted from our honorable panelist here. Amjad Niazi Sahab, I just want to share one thing with you. You talked about the child labor, and there must be a debate in the parliament on the child labor and child protection. I really, yeah. It's not unfortunate. I think so. It should be an honor for you. No. It's definitely not unfortunate. But there must be a debate in Parliament on the child labor issues and child protection issues. I really second it, and I just want that more parliamentarians should be here to see such an interactive session and such a people who are sharing extremely good views on these policies issue. So I really want to ask you that please do invite more parliamentarians here. Secondly, Naisab, you have just, I just want to share one data with you. You said that there must be a universal health system in Pakistan. I just want to say one thing. There is a universal health system in KPK. And I just want to share some facts with you. In last 1 year, February 2016 to June 2021, almost 478,973 patients were treated free of cost, and government has paid rupees 12 billion to the hospitals. So in KPK, we have started it, and we just want to expand it to the whole Pakistan. And this must be given to every Pakistani citizen. Now, coming to the point, I just want to say thanks to STPI and other organizations who are involved in the production of this report. I am highly grateful to FCDO as well as for funding this important work. All I want to say is STPI has come up with a timely and pertinent piece of research, and this institute has time and again proved to be a standard barrier and a reliable partner in development research in this country. So I really want to congratulate you people here. The report, I just want to talk about this report in times of this increasing uncertainty. We all know that in this pandemic situation, reliable information plays a very, very vital role for well-informed policy making based on evidences rather than emotions and fake news. And unfortunately, as PTI person, I must say that we are very much got hit by these fake news, and we need evidence-based things to make the policies. So I will just say the report, the role of evidence in policy making in Pakistan, this is a very, very good report, a political economy analysis report that expresses the key political factors influencing the policy making processes, the specific characteristics of political economy and the use of evidence in particularly 3 sectors, that is planning and reform, for economic development, child labor, and education pathways into employment. Child labor and education pathways into employment, we are more concerned about these 2 topics, but the third one is also help us a lot in many policy making steps. This report maps the main elements of the evidence ecosystem in our country and provides an initial assessment of evidence systems on the part of specific public agencies in 3 sectors. But I will just request this thing, and my only feeling here is that your research should not be limited to these 3 sectors. It must be more wider than these sectors. And I will say that if we will just concentrate on these 3 chosen sectors, number 1, economic development, education pathways to employment, and the child labor, they all are interrelated and essential for the development. With investing in skill sector and curbing the child labor, Pakistan can be well positioned to enhance its export and trade. As a representative of trade and commerce, I just want to say this thing that in trade and commerce affair, we made consultation a fundamental tool for devising policies. Similarly, we are working towards embedding evidences used in policy making at our training center, PTAD, what we call Pakistan Institute of Trade and Development. We are particularly committed to use this evidence for policy formulation and put up a proper response in textile and commerce sector. the findings of this report will really help us, not only the Ministry of Commerce, but Ministry of Textiles and my fellow parliamentarians, to do the decision makings, to do the policy makings. So I will just say once again that please keep guided us and please keep well equipped us with such reports. As Harun Sharif Saab has said, I will just second to him on many of his recommendations that we really want these to be implemented in government sector. But again, I will say this thing, that now the time is changing. Now this government is a bit different from the previous government. Why I'm saying this thing? Because if you will look into the parliament right now, you will feel the difference. Now we debate more on facts and figures rather than hue and cry. And now what we will do in future, we will use the more evidences, we will use all of your research work to help our parliamentarians and in our policy making steps. Thank you once again. And I want to say thanks to all of this panel here, STPI, and all the institutions who are helping us with such reports. Once again, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Alia. And lastly, I'd just like to call upon Dr. Waqar to please give a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Mahanur. Let me start by thanking our colleagues who have joined us here today. And of course, I see participation online as well. So really heartening to see the interest in this subject, interest in this topic. Unfortunately, I think I'm told that we had more registrations for in-person attendance, but due to the COVID SOPs, one could not allow greater attendance inside the hall. But happy to see that colleagues could join online as well as on Facebook Live. Let me also thank the panelists, including Amjad Nazir Saab, Dr. Friha, Madam Alia, Umar Sahab, our colleagues who joined online, including Radhika and Mr. Harun Sharif Saab. I think it's colleagues such as yourself who really find out time for this subject, and really room for reflecting on a subject like this has really been limited during the past year, at least since the COVID started. And as I had said initially as well, that things have been so much reactive at the policy making level that now it's probably time to take a stock of where we stand, what has worked during the pandemic, what hasn't, and probably change the course with the help of advice which have been given by this esteemed panel, which is over here, as well as those who are online. Let me also thank our partner institutions, including the Oxford Policy Management, Tabad Lab and Spark, as well as the wider consortium of SEDI that sits in several countries across the globe. This report, which is in your hands today, would not have been possible without the support of each and every partner. And I really hope that Radhika will communicate our vote of thanks as well as a sense of gratitude to all the other partners as well, including the team leader, Claire at Oxford. I would also finally like to thank the STPI team for bringing us together under some very challenging circumstances and making this a hybrid meeting where one could meet in person as well as colleagues could join online. So thank you to, I see that Qasim Saab is here, Ahmed, Mahanur, Hassan, our IT team, our admin team, STPI social media team, STTV team. So I think it's been a great team effort which has enabled us to do this. And I do understand that Dr. Abid Qayyum Suleri also wanted to join. He's actually involved. I think he's currently stuck up in a meeting at Secretariat and he couldn't join for the vote of thanks. So thank you very much. And I'm told that we have refreshments which are served outside. And for our online participants, I could sort of hope that they will be able to treat themselves at offices or their remote spaces. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.